The barn floor opened like a mouth. That was how Greta Morse described it later to the only person she told. A trapdoor she had cut herself in August, hidden under 18 months of packed barn dirt and a loose scatter of straw that she raked flat each morning with the same indifference she raked everything else, and which lifted on its pine frame hinges without a sound because she had greased the hardware with rendered tallow every 2 weeks since installation. She lifted it now with 2 fingers hooked under the recessed iron pull she had set flush with the surrounding planking, and the trapdoor came up clean, and the darkness below swallowed the lantern light in the way that enclosed underground spaces swallow light, partially, reluctantly, revealing the first 4 feet of the ladder and nothing below. She went down. Outside the barn, the Powder River country had been building toward this for 3 days. Not building the way storms build gradually, announcing themselves in increments that give a person time to prepare. Building the way certain Wyoming storms build, sideways, the weather arriving not from above, but from the north, in a horizontal wall of wind-driven snow that reduced visibility to the length of an outstretched arm and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in 40 minutes and kept dropping. The thermometer on the barn's exterior south wall had read -11 at 4 in the afternoon. It was now 6 in the evening. Greta had not checked the thermometer since 4 because going outside to check it was no longer a reasonable proposition. She pulled the trapdoor shut above her and descended the remaining rungs. The space below was 12 feet by 10 feet, excavated from the Powder River Basin's characteristic clay-over-gravel subsoil at a depth of 5 feet below the barn floor, which put the ceiling, the barn floor above, at a height that allowed her to stand upright with 2 inches to spare. She had spent 4 months digging it. Not continuously. She had worked it in the gaps between the claim's other demands, an hour in the morning before the day's work started, an hour in the evening after it finished, hauling the excavated soil out in a canvas bucket on a rope through the trapdoor and spreading it behind the barn in a low berm she had disguised as a drainage improvement by cutting a shallow swale through its center. Nobody had asked about the berm. Nobody had asked about anything she did on the Powder River claim because nobody came to the Powder River claim except the supply rider from Buffalo who came every 6 weeks and who had the specific incuriosity of a man paid to deliver goods rather than observe their recipients. Greta Morse was 39 years old and had been running the claim alone for 14 months since her husband Frank had ridden to Buffalo for supplies and had been thrown from his horse on the return trip on a stretch of trail that offered no witnesses and no explanation beyond the horse coming home with an empty saddle and Frank's body found the following morning by a rancher who recognized the coat. She had buried Frank on the east quarter under a flat sandstone marker she had cut herself and had gone back to the cabin and looked at the walls and made a decision she did not announce to anyone because there was no one to announce it to. She was staying. The decision to stay had produced a secondary decision that had produced the space she was now standing in. Staying alone on a Powder River Basin claim through a Wyoming winter required a survival margin that the cabin above did not provide. A single-room sod structure with a cast-iron stove and a wood supply that was adequate if nothing went wrong and catastrophically inadequate if anything did. Greta had spent her first winter alone cataloging the ways things could go wrong and ranking them by consequence. The stovepipe freezing ranked high. The wood supply running short ranked higher. The cabin itself failing. A roof collapse under snow load. A fire from an overheated stovepipe. A structural failure in the sod walls from freeze-thaw cycling, ranked highest because it left a person outside in a Wyoming winter with nothing. She had needed a backup, something the cabin's failure could not take. The space below the barn was that backup. She had lined the walls with flat sandstone slabs she had hauled from the creek bank on the stone boat across 6 weeks of September and October of the previous year, dry-laying them in tight courses against the raw clay walls to prevent collapse and moisture infiltration. The floor she had covered with 2 inches of dry sand over a layer of tar paper that served as a capillary break between the gravel subsoil and the wood plank floor she had laid over it. Inch-thick pine planks face-nailed to 3 sleepers, the same construction she had used for the cabin floor and which she knew from 14 months of observation held its temperature better than any other floor surface available to her. She had furnished it with what the space required and nothing more. A rope bed frame with a pine plank base, no rope webbing, which sagged and compressed and lost its insulating air gap over time, but solid planking covered with a 4-inch layer of wool batting she had accumulated from Frank's winter coat and 2 blankets she had cut apart and restuffed. A small clay firebox against the north wall with a horizontal flue she had run through the barn foundation using the same angle calculation she had worked out with a protractor and a straight stick, 14 degrees from horizontal, the minimum angle at which combustion gases rose with sufficient velocity to maintain draft through a 4-foot horizontal run before angling upward through the foundation to exit at ground level behind a woodpile. She had tested the draft in July. She had stocked the space in August. 40 split pine pieces stacked against the east wall, a water barrel with a fitted lid, dried corn and salt pork and beans in sealed tins, a second lantern with 2 full oil reservoirs, the .44-40 Winchester she had carried down the ladder, 1 careful rung at a time, and hung on 2 iron pegs above the bed. She had told no one. Now the Powder River country's deadliest blizzard in a decade was pressing itself against the barn walls 6 feet above her head, and Greta Morse was lighting the clay firebox with a dry pine shaving and a single match, and watching the draft pull the flame toward the flue opening with the clean, decisive lean of a system that was working exactly as she had designed it to work. She had 40 split pine pieces. She had the wool batting and the sealed tins and the second lantern. She had built this for exactly this night. The clay firebox took 11 minutes to establish a working heat output. Greta had timed it in July during the draft test, and had timed it again in October when she ran the first full burn to confirm the system's winter behavior under actual cold conditions, rather than the moderate temperatures of the test period. 11 minutes from match to sustained radiant heat output from the firebox walls. She had noted this in the small notebook she kept on the shelf above the firebox alongside the temperature readings she had been recording since October. Outside temperature from the barn wall thermometer, space temperature from the mercury thermometer she kept on the shelf, differential between the two. The notebook had 41 entries. The differential across those 41 entries ranged from 18 degrees on the mildest nights to 31 degrees on the coldest. Tonight was going to produce a new number. She could not check the barn wall thermometer without going outside, which she was not going to do. She estimated the outside temperature from what she had felt on her face during the 30 seconds she had spent crossing from the cabin to the barn before descending the ladder, the specific quality of cold that registered not as temperature, but as pressure, the kind of cold that arrived at the skin simultaneously from all directions rather than from the wind direction alone, which meant the air mass was dense and still at ground level, despite the wind above and which in her experience indicated temperatures below -20. She recorded the estimate in the notebook. Estimated -22 based on skin assessment. Time of entry 6:14 p.m. The firebox walls were radiating measurable heat by -8. By minute 11, the space temperature had climbed 2 degrees from its ambient of 44. The earth temperature the space had been holding all day without any fire. By minute 20, it had climbed to 51. And Greta removed her outer coat and hung it on the iron peg beside the Winchester and sat on the edge of the bed platform with her hands extended toward the firebox and felt the warmth arrive at her palms in the specific way that radiant heat from dense material arrives, not in waves, not in gusts, but as a continuous, steady pressure, the heat of stone that has absorbed combustion energy and is releasing it at the rate of its own thermal mass, rather than the rate of the flame that charged it. She ate salt pork from the tin directly, cold, without heating it. Heating food consumed firewood she had calculated to last 14 days at 1 fire per day of 4-hour duration. She had not calculated for cooking. Cooking was a separate fuel budget she had not built into the 14-day estimate because 14 days was already more than any Powder River blizzard had run in her experience, and she had no intention of running short before the storm did. She had been in the space for 40 minutes when she heard the cabin go. Not dramatically, not a collapse or an explosion. A sound she felt more than heard. A low structural groan transmitted through the earth and into the barn floor 6 feet above her, followed by a series of shorter sounds that her mind identified in sequence as she sat still and listened. The cast iron stove tipping from its pad, the stovepipe separating at the collar joint, the sod wall section above the stovepipe penetration releasing its frost-heaved bond and sliding inward, and then nothing, which was the silence of a structure that has completed a failure sequence and has reached its new equilibrium. The cabin's north wall had given way. She knew it without seeing it because she had been watching that wall's frost-heave cycle since her first winter on the claim and had measured the annual movement of the northwest corner post with a pencil mark on the post and a date beside it. The post had moved 3/4 of an inch inward in the first winter, 5/8 in the second, and 1 inch in the 14 months since Frank's death, during which she had not had time to repack the foundation because the other work had been more urgent. 1 inch of inward movement on a frost-heaved corner post under sustained -22 cold, with wind load on the north face, was a failure condition she had identified in her survival ranking 14 months ago and had placed at the top of the list. She had built this space because of that ranking. The cabin had confirmed the ranking's accuracy on a schedule she had not predicted precisely, but had known was coming. She updated the notebook. 6:54 p.m. Cabin north wall failure. Sound transmitted through subsoil. No investigation possible. Space integrity unaffected. Space integrity unaffected. She read those 3 words back to herself, and then set the notebook on the shelf and fed 2 more pine splits into the firebox and lay down on the wool batting with her coat across her legs and looked at the clay ceiling, the barn floor above her, the 6 feet of earth around her, the sandstone wall lining holding the clay face back from the space she occupied, the horizontal flue pulling combustion gases through the foundation to the woodpile outside in a clean, sustained draft that produced no smoke in the interior air whatsoever. The space temperature at 9 in the evening was 58 degrees. She had 40 pine splits remaining minus the 4 she had burned. 36 splits. 14 days of planned burn. The math still worked. She slept. Not immediately. She lay in the wool batting warmth, listening to the blizzard work at the barn structure above her. The sustained bass roar of wind at the roofline, the rhythmic percussion of the north wall boards flexing under load, the creak of the ridge beam taking lateral force in the gusts. These were not alarming sounds. They were the sounds of a structure experiencing design loads within its capacity, which was different from the sounds she had heard at 6:54 when the cabin wall released. She knew the difference, and the difference told her the barn was holding, and the space below it was holding, and the firebox was doing what the firebox was supposed to do. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Powder River country delivered the second night of what would become the worst blizzard recorded in Wyoming territory in 11 years. Inside the space below the barn, 5 feet beneath the surface that the blizzard was working at, the temperature held at 54 degrees with the fire banked and the flue damper set to 1/4, and the wool batting doing what 4 inches of compressed wool batting does when it is the only thing standing between a sleeping woman and the arithmetic of a Wyoming winter. It was enough. It was exactly enough, and not 1 degree more, which was the margin Greta Morse had calculated in September of 1882 and had built to in the 14 months since, and which the blizzard was now confirming with the same precision her notebook had been predicting all along. The cabin was gone on the morning of day 3. Not entirely. The south wall and the east wall were standing, the cast iron stove still on its pad with the collapsed north wall section piled against it, the roof partially intact over the south half where the ridge beam had held. What was gone was the cabin as shelter. The north wall opening admitted the full force of the Powder River blizzard into the structure's interior, and the interior temperature had equalized with the outside air sometime in the night, which meant the water barrel had frozen solid. The remaining food stores were frozen, and the cast-iron stove was buried under sod brick and frozen debris that would require days of work to clear. Greta knew all of this without going inside. She had gone as far as the cabin doorway on the morning of day 3, wrapped in both the coat and the wool blanket she had carried up from the space below, and had looked at the north wall from the threshold, and had done the assessment in 45 seconds, and gone back to the barn and descended the ladder and pulled the trapdoor shut and updated the notebook. Day 3 morning. Cabin north wall confirmed collapsed. Interior exposed to ambient. Estimated full structural loss as functional shelter. Space below barn unaffected. Outside temperature estimated -19 based on skin exposure during assessment. Remaining pine splits, 31. She drew a line under the entry and turned to the next page. The critical calculation on day 3 was not heat. The space was managing heat with the precision the notebook had been documenting since October. The critical calculation was water. Her sealed water barrel held 12 gallons, which at her consumption rate of approximately 1 quart per day gave her 48 days of water without resupply, far beyond any storm duration she needed to plan for. What she had not fully calculated was the effect of sustained -19 on a barrel sitting in a space at 54 degrees, which was a temperature differential sufficient to freeze the barrel's outer inch of water against the stave walls if she did not keep the fire at a sustained output level rather than the banking rate she had been using to conserve fuel. She adjusted the damper to half open and fed a split every 3 hours instead of 4. The adjustment consumed her fuel reserve faster than the 14-day estimate. She recalculated. 31 splits at 1 split per 3 hours gave her approximately 93 hours of sustained output, 3 days and 21 hours. The blizzard was on day 3. If it ran past day 7, she would need to source additional fuel. She noted the recalculation in the notebook and then noted the contingency below it. The barn above her held the remaining hay supply for the 2 horses she had moved to the neighbor's property in October when the neighbor's son had offered to winter them in exchange for spring labor, a decision she had made partly for the horses' welfare and partly because 2 horses consuming hay in a barn above a hidden underground space created a variable she preferred not to manage through a blizzard. The hay was gone. What remained in the barn was the tool storage, the empty stone boat, and 8 feet of pine plank she had bought in August for a fencing project she had not yet completed. 8 feet of pine plank was not split firewood. It was cuttable into firewood with the small cross-cut saw she had stored in the space below, specifically against this contingency. Having identified in her survival ranking that fuel extension would be the primary day 4 problem in any sustained weather event. She had stored the saw in August. She went up through the trapdoor on the afternoon of day 4 and cut 4 of the 8 pine planks into firebox-sized pieces in the barn's interior, working with the cross-cut saw in the barn's relative shelter while the blizzard ran at the exterior walls. The work took 40 minutes. She carried the cut pieces down the ladder in 3 loads and added them to the stack against the east wall and updated the notebook. Day 4 afternoon. Fuel extension. 4 pine planks cut to length. Estimated additional burn time 41 hours at current consumption rate. Revised total fuel duration. Day 9 projected. She put the notebook on the shelf and fed the firebox and lay down on the wool batting and looked at the clay ceiling and did the arithmetic one more time to confirm it matched what the notebook said. It matched. The blizzard broke on the morning of day 6. She heard it break from the space below, the roar at the barn roofline dropping register the way it had dropped in the Palo Duro cave story she had never read, and the Absaroka cave that Lenora Crane had occupied, and the Judith Basin space where Marin Sol had built her pine box, all of them hearing the same acoustic signature of a storm system losing its organized pressure and beginning its retreat. The sustained roar became intermittent. The intermittent became occasional. By mid-morning, the barn walls had stopped flexing under lateral load, and the ridge beam had stopped its low, periodic creak, and the only sound above her was the settling silence of a structure that had come through something and was standing on the other side of it. She climbed the ladder and pushed the trapdoor open and stood in the barn and listened. Wind, diminishing. The specific quality of post-storm air, cold and clean, and without the wet density that storm air carried. She went to the barn door and cracked it 2 inches and looked out at the Powder River country in the gray morning light of day 6. The snow had drifted to the top of the fence line on the north and west sides of the barn. The cabin's south and east walls were visible above the drifts, the collapsed north wall section buried under a consolidated snow mass that had packed into the opening and was now structural in the way that wind-consolidated snow becomes structural, not soft, not movable without tools, a white wall where the sod wall had been. She looked at all of it for a long moment and went back inside the barn and descended the ladder and sat on the edge of the bed platform and opened the notebook to the Day 6 entry. Day 6 morning. Storm break confirmed. Outside temperature estimated -8, improving. Space temperature 52 degrees. Remaining fuel, 19 splits plus 4 cut planks. Water barrel intact, full liquid. Cabin, south and east walls standing. North wall buried in consolidated drift. Structure non-recoverable as primary shelter. She read the last line back to herself. Non-recoverable as primary shelter. She had written it without hesitation, without the specific grief that the sentence deserved, because the notebook was not a place for grief. The notebook was a place for data, and the data said the cabin was gone, and the space below the barn had held, and those were the 2 facts the morning required. The supply rider from Buffalo came on day 9. His name was Cord Pitts, and he had been riding the Powder River supply route for 4 years and had seen most of what the Wyoming Territory could produce in the way of weather events and human responses to them. And he pulled up at the Morse claim gate on day 9 with a wagon carrying 6 weeks of supplies and looked at the collapsed cabin and the drifted yard and the barn standing intact with a thin thread of smoke rising from its south foundation face, and sat on the wagon seat for a long moment, doing the arithmetic of what he was seeing. He called out. Greta came out of the barn door with the Winchester on her shoulder and her notebook in her left hand and looked at him across the drifted yard. He asked if she was all right. She said she was. She said the cabin had lost its north wall on day 1, and she had spent the blizzard in the barn. She said this in the flat informational way she said most things, and Cord Pitts accepted it with the flat informational nod of a man who has learned that the Powder River country produced people who said less than what had actually happened to them, and that the gap between what they said and what had happened was usually significant. He looked at the smoke coming from the barn foundation. He asked about the smoke. She said she had made some modifications to the barn's heating system. She said she would explain it if he wanted to come inside. He tied the wagon team to the gate post and followed her into the barn and watched her lift the trap door from the packed dirt floor and descend the ladder and disappear into the space below and call up to him that there was coffee on if he wanted to come down. Cord Pitts stood at the open trap door looking at the warm light rising from below and the ladder descending into it and the faint smell of pine smoke and coffee coming up through the opening. And he took his hat off and held it in both hands and looked at what Greta Morse had built under her barn floor across 14 months of early mornings and late evenings, while the Powder River country went about its business above her. Then he put his hat back on and climbed down. He delivered supplies to the Morse claim for 11 more years. He never mentioned the space below the barn to anyone on the route. She never asked him not to. Some things on the Powder River country were understood without being stated, and what a woman built under her barn floor to keep herself alive through a Wyoming winter was one of them.